Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you listening on the Life Online Radio Network at lifebroadcastingcenter.com, we welcome you in. For those of you listening in on our YouTube channel, Silverlight, we welcome you in. As I was preparing this show, I kind of got myself a little bit confused between Samhain and Saturnalia, which is why everybody needs our sponsor, Affinity Writing and Editing Services. While a computer program does a good job at spell check and grammar check, real live people, like the quality people at Affinity Writing and Editing Services, will catch little mistakes like that and make your life just a little bit better, because Samhain and Saturnalia are completely different things. Always, always, always use a human editor. So check out the people at Affinity Writing Services at Affinity WES. Both on Twitter and on Facebook, at Affinity WES, all one word. Speaking of Samhain, or Halloween as you might know it colloquially, it's that time of year, again. This is going to be a very unusual take on the Halloween season because of the pandemic. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. For anybody out there giving out candy, God bless you all and keep you all safe. For any kids out there looking for candy, I'm not sure why you're listening to this show, but I still hope you get a whole lot. But Samhain marked the end of the Harvest Festival. So technically, October 31st, Halloween, should mark the end of the harvest season. So in Canada, where Thanksgiving comes during the month of October, they're actually getting the tradition relatively right. Not saying the United States is wrong for holding in November. After all, the United States harvest season is a little bit more generous than the cold Canadian North, and Canada was populated by mostly European settlers with much more recent past and more recent ties to Europe than what the United States went through. So it's understandable the United States would change that around from their harvest season. But the tradition, the most important thing is Samhain, Halloween, All Hallows Eve. Now, Samhain was celebrated from sundown October 31st to sundown November 1st. A lot of ancient holidays were celebrated sundown to sundown because daylight is somewhat tricky, and sunup to sunup is a lot harder festival to celebrate when you think about it. Sunup to sunup means everybody wakes up 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m., whatever it is during the year, and that's pretty miserable to get a whole bunch of people up. You kind of see this every single time you have morning services at any sort of ceremonial place, be it a church, a mosque, synagogue. Early morning services tend not to be the most energetic, and that's no offense to the people going there and professing their faith. It's just a simple fact. First thing in the morning, people are not at their best. And Samhain is supposed to be a celebration. The end of Harvest Festival. We have gotten to the end of our crops. Our wheat has all been plowed. We've slaughtered the pigs, slaughtered the lamb, whatever it might be. So you have a celebration at night. When you think of your big meals, everything that you've had in your life, they all generally come at night. You don't think of a great lunch. You don't usually think of a great breakfast. You think of a great dinner that you had. And that's exactly why celebrations, proper celebrations, tend to happen at night. It not only makes sense to the ancient mind, but the modern mind, because that's really just human psychology. The 9th century is when the Western Church decided it was going to shift the holiday from October 31st sundown to November 1st. because they weren't really happy with the pagan connotations of Samhain. And November 1st became All Saints' Day. But traditions never die. They just wear new masks. So All Hallows' Eve maintained the tradition of Samhain. And Samhain is about the end of the harvest season, the winter coming in, and we know winter is a very unforgiving time of year. When winter comes around, if you're not living in a modern civilization, and if you don't fish, you don't hunt, you don't trap, you starve. So paying attention to the ancestral spirits, which is exactly what Samhain was there to do, is very important in a winter setting. Because the ancestral spirits watching over you, if they were well taken care of, would smile down on you and grant you a good year. Which is one of the reasons why Samhain, All Hallows' Eve, All Saints' Day, the next day, whatever you want to call it, was supposed to honor the ancestors. And of course, once you start getting into ancestor worship, that kind of necessarily brings with it the concept of ghosts. Now, I'm not saying every ancestor was a ghost, but a large number of them were considered spirits that would appear in a more or less beneficent or maleficent capacity, depending on how you honored them and depending on what happened to them. This is widespread around the world, from North America to Asia to Australia. The idea that the ancestors roam around and directly impact the living is pretty darn common. The Chinese have all sorts of stories about, I think one of their most common ghost stories is about a student who spends a night at a place and in the morning wakes up to find out that it was just ghosts looking after him the whole night. The First Nations have so many legends, I couldn't even begin to get into them. When we go back in history, some of the earliest ghost stories date back to Sumeria. That would be the very first civilization that we know of, that we have archaeological evidence for, that's a fully properly organized system. Now, there are outliers like Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, which are cities, but we don't really know how much territory they controlled. So while Göbekli Tepe dates back almost 12,000 years ago, Sumeria might only date back 6,000 years. But in Sumeria we have an established empire, we have a hierarchy, we have a written system of laws, we have everything that we can look at and say, this is civilization. And also, the memories of Sumeria are recorded for us to enjoy today because they had developed writing, one of the earliest writing systems that we know of and can translate. Quite likely before that there was some sort of pictographic writing system, but the Sumerians are unfortunately the first ones that we understand. And the Sumerians definitely had ghost stories. Indeed, their gods had ghost stories. There's the legend of Inanna, who was basically Ishtar, and she had to descend into her sister's realm because she wanted to find her lover. Now, Ereshkigal was her sister, so Inanna, or Ishtar, and Ereshkigal, they're sisters. And Ereshkigal rules in Kala, which is basically kind of like hell. It's a little less defined. They're not the spirits we think of in hell today, where they're being punished and tortured and, burned eternally while they're trying to reach for water and it's being taken out of their grasp. The ancient concept of hell is not so graphic. They had the idea mostly of you would become a shadow, a shade, something that was you but not quite you. So modern day equivalent would kind of be a ghost, but the ghosts were all kind of in one location. At any rate, it was wise not to go to Inkala, because Ereshkigal had declared that no one could leave ever. And indeed, as Inanna went down to find her lover, Ereshkigal ordered her to strip naked, piece by piece. She would stop her at one place, say, you've got to remove your headdress. Next place, you've got to remove your breastplate. Next place, you've got to remove your sandals. And so on and so forth, until Inanna, or Ishtar if you'd prefer, was stripped naked before the Lady of Death herself. No spirit was allowed any escape, so it's not really precisely clear how, but Inanna was eventually dead. There is probably some sort of shenanigans there, but whatever the case is, it's been lost to us over the past 6,000 years, unfortunately. Now, Ereshkigal did keep her word. Ishtar did not leave alive. But another god, Enki, brother of Enlil, sent a messenger who was going to revive and retrieve her. Because Ishtar was not powerful enough to escape hell, that's why she needed the messenger, because Enki knew he would not be powerful enough to go down, but he was able to engineer a messenger, and a messenger would be allowed to pass freely. In ancient times and in modern times, messengers kind of have an aura of immunity about them. You're not allowed to mess with them. And the ancient times, when they would be saying, this person is sacred, you can't touch them, that would be the only way that you could enter and leave hell. Ishtar was going on a mission, whereas the messenger was bringing goodwill from one god to another. Now, Ishtar, because Inanna becomes Ishtar, was a well-known god in the Middle East. She got around quite a bit, and indeed, she still has worshippers to this day. And she was also worshipped in the lands around the tribes who became the Israelites. They would have been very familiar with Ishtar's mythology, if not because in the Bible, supposedly, they were willing to stray after Astaroth, which was close pronunciation to Ishtar, but also because if you're living on a border city, you're pretty likely to trade with the people across the border. It's been a problem kings and queens and emperors have had for centuries, and it's also been a major economic factor. It's true today, where despite the fact that there's a wall being built, cities between the United States and Mexico still trade back and forth, and they're always going to. But that's how the Israelites became familiar with Ishtar, and this whole legend of her coming back from the dead. And it probably took hold in embryo there for at least a couple thousand years. But the Israelites didn't really like this idea of consulting the dead. The text of the Bible tells us, because the reality of what the Israelites did and what they profess to have done are two different things, just like everybody else in the world. There's a few very straight-laced people, straight-edge society, who will obey the letter of the law, but most people are going to go out to McDonald's, have their hamburger with bacon, drink it down with a beer, and smoke a cigarette on the way out. That's just the way people have always been. The Israelites didn't want to deal with this death cult. And because of that, the Bible has prohibitions against witchcraft, which you can basically say is consulting with the spirits. Exodus 22:18 and Leviticus 20:22 both say that the Israelites shall not permit mediums or necromancers. Mediums being kind of the precursors to psychics, I'll say, where they can hold seances and talk to the dead, and necromancers who are able to force the dead to come up from the below and answer questions. Because again, when something is going wrong, Having an ancestor you can turn to who hopefully is in a good mood and you've treated well is an invaluable resource because they're in contact with the spirit world. This is also why a lot of sacrifices happen in the ancient world, because if you got too close to the spirit world, you might as well go join them, so they would sacrifice you. But back to the rules. The reason rules are written down is so that people are aware of them. And the reason that you need to make people aware of rules is because people are doing the thing you don't want them to do. As I said, definitely in the lands around ancient Israel, there would be ancestor cults. Cults where you take care of your dead, cults where you take care of family, and cults where you take care of famous people. And the ancient Israelites, as they like to portray themselves, were monotheistic. So you're supposed to pray to the Most High and nobody else. Your ancestors would not be able to help you. That's one of the reasons, among many, that they were so against encouraging anybody to go to a necromancer, to go to a medium, even to go to a psychic. And this is something that has echoed mostly in the Western world up to the present day. In the Eastern lands, in North America and Australia, it's not considered such a bad thing to talk to the spirits. Whereas in the Western world, and in Europe, in North America, it is considered a very, very edgy thing at the very least. And it appears that the Israelites inherited the idea of consulting spirits from Sumeria and Egypt. After all, those were two of their biggest, closest companions. That's why they went to all the trouble to try to squash it. Now, despite all these prohibitions, we have the tale of the Witch of Endor. Saul, the very first king of Israel, was in a conflict with the Philistines. And while he was going around trying to get rid of the mediums and necromancers, which you can read, he was trying to kill them. So he went to the Witch of Endor. And the Witch of Endor was suspicious because here's a man obviously well taken care of, well fed, exercising because he's a warrior king. And he's suddenly coming in to this witch who is practicing her craft. And she says, I don't believe you. I think you're trying to trap me and get me in trouble in front of the king. King Saul says, no, I'm just here. I got to get a hold of Samuel and find out what's going on. Samuel was the prophet who anointed King Saul and King David. But he anointed King Saul, told King Saul that he had not been following God's commandments, and anointed King David. After that, he passed away. So while there's a schism in ancient Israel, Saul, who's also fighting the Philistines, is so desperate he goes to the Witch of Endor. And they bring up the soul of Samuel. Now, Samuel, being the prophet that he was and being the righteous person that he was, promptly goes on to scold Saul. And he tells him he's lost God's favor and he's going to be killed by the morning. And that's 20 Samuel and around there. So the prophet, once again, is standing up to the king, to the witch, and basically telling them, you are committing a sin before God. And that's why neither one of you is going to see the morning. So this means that the Hebrews were recounting stories like this, not just to frighten their children, but also so that people like witches, like necromancers, wouldn't be making a living in their lands. It was pretty profitable to be a witch or a necromancer or a medium because people do like to know the will of the Almighty. It's profitable to know whether what you're going to do next is going to be success or not. Because, say, if I had any doubt about this show and I went to a psychic or a medium, they're going to charge me $20, let's say, for a 15-minute session. And they're going to look into their crystal ball. I hate to say that. It's a bit of a stereotype. Put some tarot cards against me, whatever their thing is. And with that, they're going to say there's good omens, there's bad omens. You need to consider your friends, your luck, whatever the case might be. Now, the Hebrews authored the Old Testament, which influenced the apostles and the church. And the church was forming, and it was really having a hard time at the very first couple centuries, right up until about the 12th century, I would give it. They were dealing with their own, this rich tradition that they had, and the most central tenets that they had in it were not to deal with spirits of the dead. That's one of the reasons why when Jesus comes up out of the tomb, everybody is so afraid of him at first, because they're thinking he's one of these spirits come back to life. And he has to spend so much time proving, no, he is the same guy. He's, to doubting Thomas, he has to put his fingers in the holes. And this is why Jesus is partially regarded as a terrifying figure, and why we still have the, let's be honest, very grotesque image of him on a cross being murdered. And that was purposely there to show that even in this horrible image, there is still hope and there is still goodness for everybody. But let's go back to, this is kind of the same time. In the Odyssey and the Aeneid, which are both, the Odyssey is composed about the 5th century BC, and the Aeneid is composed about just about the 1st century AD. And both of these heroes, Odysseus and Aeneas, have to descend down to Hades in order to get to the land of the dead to seek advice. The stories show that all over the ancient world, people were communing with the dead. It's Western world, Eastern world, whatever you might have. See, the dead were not just there to have advice sought of them. They were real entities with needs and desires. Aeneas and Odysseus have to offer sacrificial blood to bring the souls out from Hades, and only once those souls have had their blood are they willing to answer questions. Even when Aeneas is talking to his own father, his father insists on drinking first, and then he'll answer his son's question. Despite the fact that he was carried out on his son's back, he still has the right in the hereafter to say, I need my needs satisfied first. Another thing is, it's a worldwide tradition that a human that died badly would return somehow. The dead do not like to be mistreated. They want to make sure everything is okay. So countless ghost stories exist out there where somebody comes back to haunt a place until a wrong is set right, until justice comes, various things. I'm not going to get into telling specific ghost stories this week because in October I kind of want to concentrate on cryptids and the paranormal, that sort of thing, because that's what I really think the spirit of October has. I might tell ghost stories at some point, but tonight I might do one later on, we'll see. If we look at Suetonius, who was a biographer of the ancient Roman emperors, he tells us that there was a country mansion near the city of Velitrae, which was the nursery of Emperor Augustus. So when Octavian was just a little child, his family had a mansion, and it was very much esteemed to him. Apparently through his entire life, he looked after this villa, he kept it, and made sure that there were priests when he was gone who would continue looking after it. Because Roman emperors believed in a process called apotheosis, where, yes, indeed, some people did die and become shades, but others were raised up to heaven to become gods. Julius Caesar, for example, was deified because when he passed away, one of the miracles that was around him was the fact that when he was on his funeral pyre, a comet went overhead, and that showed them that he had become divine. Augustus did so much, well, first of all, he was the first emperor, but he did so much for the city, and there were portents, which I can't recall them at the present time. There were portents surrounding his death to make him beware of it, that he was also considered to have become divine. He was apotheosized into a god. But going back to the mansion, there's priests around this mansion keeping it safe, and religious scruples forbade anyone to even enter his nursery. But a new owner came along, and after 100 years or so, legends begin to fade and people start to disbelieve. It's like how people nowadays have this desire to sleep in the pharaoh's tomb in the pyramids. The only problem is the pyramids were never tombs for the pharaohs. But I digress. Back to this little villa, the new owner decided he was going to sleep there. And overnight something happened. He was found thrown out of bed, lying by the door and half dead. So clearly something happened there. Perhaps the spirit of Augustus himself was returning the insult for daring to interrupt his nursery. But at any rate, it shows us that you don't mess with the dead, you don't mess with their wishes. It's an interesting fact that the Eastern religions were able to successfully incorporate ancestor worship into their structure, but Western religions really struggled with it. Now, part of this is the fact that the Ishtar cult had a huge following in Rome. And Rome was where Western Christianity, the Catholic Church, the Reformation, the Protestants, all have their roots. And this backlash against the cult of Ishtar, which was a big, significant force in Rome, which had its ancestor worship cult, which had a whole structure that had been in place for thousands of years. That's one of the reasons why the church and the Jewish people rejected that whole line of thinking, because it was a bane to their existence. One reason for this is, again, until the 9th century, the Western Church was a chaotic place. Popes came in, they were reckless, they were debauched, they would have wives, mistresses, they would have the whole 9 yards. Some popes even tried to appoint their own children as their successors. And at one point, one of the popes dug up one of the previous popes, Pope Formosus, put him on trial. Now, of course, since a dead man can't speak, there was a deacon who was appointed to answer for him. Naturally, the deacon didn't want to get his head cut off, so he simply answered whatever the Pope wanted, and they cast Pope Formosus into the river. But it's told that the body of Pope Formosa started performing miracles. And this caused people to rise up against the Pope who had replaced him, kick him out, and put yet another one on the throne. This did happen a lot in the 9th century. And it's... I can't even begin to get in. That would be a fun show, would be to go through just what popes did. But basically, this is where the popes are busy trying to sack each other. You've got Vikings moving in, pagan Vikings who are raiding into Francia, which is France and Germany. You have the Bulgarians who are coming in, who are an unknown force, the Slavonic people who are an unknown force, and the church really does not have a grasp on this situation yet. At this point, the church in Constantinople, the Eastern Orthodox Church, is in a far, far better place. The Western Church in the 9th century is almost out of existence. So they do what pretty much everybody else who's been successful over time does, and they change the name of things. They changed the name of the holiday from Samhain to All Saints' Day. Clever PR move, but changing a name to a name and date might not seem significant, but it was a sign. See, the church was no longer going to be ignored. While the northern nations of England, or England as you might call it, Francia, the Slavonic tribes, as I mentioned, the Bulgarians, they welcomed their ancestors to feast through the rules of Samhain. Even though that they were Christian, they were still showing that they were publicly Christian and privately pagan. Just as many people are today. There's always a difference between how somebody projects themselves and what they do in private. Just as we're finding out right now in 2020, where so many people are different sexualities, you know what? That's fine. No problem. You can do whatever you like in your bedroom, and we've established you can do whatever you like in religion. It doesn't affect me. The mindset of the 9th century was very different. They needed the community to all be on the same page. They needed the community to get behind them because they're dealing with centuries worth of chaos and trying to establish one ruler, and that would be the Pope. I should say the popes because there's a white pope, there's a black pope, and there's a red pope, but again, that's for another story, another day. Samhain never really went away. Just as psychics never went away, just as ancestor worship never went away, just as the custom of leaving a cup for absent friends has never really gone away. Now, it's always said that the art of an age is strongest in the ideals that are least exemplified in its execution. What this means is art shows the things that we're afraid to admit in public. A lot of people say they hate modern art, but at the same token, there's a lot of people buying it. Television. Everybody says they hate reality television, but there's a lot of people watching it. And that's just simply the way things are. Across the centuries, we're going to fast forward from the 9th century to the Victorian era, the 1800s, late 1800s, really early 1900s. And now all of a sudden, through all this persecution, through all this ritual and ceremony that has evolved over the years, and we always think of Victorians as very straight-laced and very nose in the air, going around making sure everybody's prim and proper. And that's why mediums and seances were kind of a hedonistic way to challenge that straight-laced society. It wasn't just a little bit of a game for them. They were getting their kicks out of having a medium come over and tell them of the spirits and make apports appear, which, for you don't know what apports are, it's the ability of a medium to manifest something out of thin air. Like anything else, there were frauds. There were definitely mediums and psychics that did some unconscionable things, but the fact is there was money to be made. And anytime there's money to be made from rich people who are giving it away, someone's going to come up with an angle. Now, it would be completely unfair to say that those mediums and psychics were not legit. I'm sure a good portion of them were legitimate. I'm sure a lot of them believed what they were telling. But in 2020, we still haven't proved the idea of life after death or psychic phenomena. It all comes down to who you believe, because I'm not going to give you the answer. I have an opinion, a strong opinion, but it would be wrong of me to force my views upon anybody else. I'm just here to give you as much information as I can, not necessarily my opinion. But back to Victorian society. Again, you have to think of a rather raucous atmosphere going on because the Victorians would sit around and smoke their cigars, drink brandy, and oh, we've got the medium coming over. So the medium would come in. Let's pretend for a second that it's a medium who really believes in what she's doing and is not trying to make some extra money on the side. So she gathers everybody in a circle around a table. They all hold hands. And then there's some knocks and noises, and she tells them she can hear messengers, just like today when Oprah's not on TV anymore, but, those daytime talk shows have someone on and say, oh, there's somebody in the audience who had somebody who died recently. Well, of course there is, and that audience probably is about 15, 20 of them, odds say. And the medium could probably do the same thing in a Victorian setting. Oh, I'm getting the feeling that someone's had a sickness lately. Well, it's a Victorian era. Someone would have been sick recently because there wasn't medicine as we know it. The medicine they had was pretty much cocaine. I don't think methamphetamines had been invented yet, but marijuana was around, opium was around, and that was how they treated their afflictions. They just drugged the heck out of themselves. So the medium, again, trying to be legitimate, asks a leading question, and somebody says, I have. And then, perhaps to get a couple knocks on the table. Oh, that's your uncle, and he wants to come in. Now, whether those knocks were done by the medium or they were produced through a psychic phenomena, which is possible. We always talk about mind over matter, especially for people trying to motivate themselves. And believe me, mind over matter does work. Not 100%, but it does work. And that was a titillating little fanciful afternoon, evening pastime for the Victorians. And we have some interesting names coming out of that time. Madame Blavatsky, the Fox sisters, who were vetted by Sir Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock series. Franz Mesmer, the hypnotist who we get the term mesmerize from. Eliphas Levi, who was probably the world's most notorious magician before Aleister Crowley came along. And Albert Pike. And those people offered just incredible insight for wealthy families. They not only were writing books, they were appearing in public, they were giving lectures, and this is a time when the Christians and the scientists should have been booing them out of the room, but they had enough supporters that they could, instead of a century before where they would be hanged as witches, here they were going around as relatively wealthy members of society and being accepted in circles that you and I could not go to. Dukes, our marquises, all sorts of people that get parades wherever they go. And this is called the beginning of the New Age. But it wasn't a New Age. It's the same original pagan ideals with a fresh coat of paint on them. Blavatsky, Mesmer, Levi, Pike all mentioned specifically that they were getting their messages from back in time, from ancestors. They specifically said that. And even to today, when New Agers are talking about things like yoga, I'm trying to think of what that's called, acupuncture, whatever it is, these are all very traditional forms of medicine. And they do have validity. Don't dismiss them, because I never thought acupuncture would do a single thing to me, but I tried it, and it works very well for about 6 hours for me. But I can't find a person to give me a new treatment every 6 hours, unfortunately. Back on the subject, though. Blavatsky, Mesmer, Levi, and Pike in particular managed to get societies forming around them. The Theosophical Society, which is still around today to a much lesser degree. At one point was multinational, and now it's pretty much restricted to Britain. But these people were charismatic oddities, and they preached the old ways, the old gods, and the old ways. That was what they were trying to do. So when you look at it, Ishtar never went silent. She just learned to whisper to the new generation. And Ishtar, the feminine goddess, comes at us in many guises. She has been referred to as the threefold goddess: the virgin, the mother, and the old hag. These three are considered normal parts of a woman's life, and there's nothing wrong with it. But that's what she exemplified: the virgin, the mother, and the old hag. Ishtar was all three. By bringing the spirits of the past back, and specifically Ishtar, Blavatsky and all actually did us a great service, because they reconnected us with our roots. Not knowing the past is not only dangerous because of the old adage, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. That's not the only reason that the past is important. The past is also important because, again, in the Western world, we lost the idea of the supernatural for many years. And we spent a lot of time making fun at primitive savages in other lands, in Asia, even the Chinese and the Japanese, who have rich cultures that are, the myths are just exquisite to read. But we spent a couple hundred years making fun of them rather than trying to understand them, because they're outside the wheelhouse of what we in the Western world expect. We had forgotten our ancestors, and because of that, we couldn't relate to the people who had remembered their ancestors. So the first New Age people, the Theosophists, the first mediums and psychics that came in, for all the weirdness they did us a great service. They inspired Jung to write about psychology. And indeed, Freud and Jung had a long-standing rivalry just based around the fact that Jung believed in paranormal phenomena and Freud did not. Although Freud said if he had another life to live, he would have devoted it to parapsychology, the paranormal. And even to the modern day. But the modern day, unfortunately, has once again struck back against these ideals. Ishtar might be alive and well, and our ancestors might be slowly working their ways back into our houses, whether it be through Halloween, whether it be through shrines. There's all sorts of ways that they manage to come back. But once again, we run into greedy corporations. Companies have taken over Samhain. They've taken over Halloween. Once upon a time, people would give out homemade sweets. Now we're told that apples are dangerous. No. You buy our prepackaged candy that we've filled with toxic chemicals, red dye, which has been very controversial over the years. But that's considered a good candy to get. Now, kids, I don't blame them for wanting candy bars. Everybody wants chocolate. And admittedly, there have been some very unpleasant individuals who, over the years, have perpetuated this Halloween candy scare. I would not allow my children to take handmade goods from somebody else just because of the horror stories, and I think that's quite a shame. It's not the fact that we're buying the candy from corporations, because I know most people do not have time to make 100 or 1,000 or however many candies that you would be making for all these kids. Yes, not everybody is Holly Homemaker in this world. I can accept that. But the fact that they've been so demonized that an apple, no, it could be full of razor blades. It is very rare for them to find razor blades in apples. It's very rare for them to find anything bad in any Halloween candy that's not prepackaged. But the fact is, they keep the rumors going because it suits big business. And this is why I don't think Halloween is going to be celebrated very much this year. Big business is going to take a hit, but they're going to take those candies, they're going to stick them on a shelf in a warehouse somewhere, and they're going to trot them all out next year pretending that they're fresh. And we're going to buy them up. And you know what? That's as far as Halloween means to most people. One day a year where you stick out a couple decorations, you listen to the doorbell go ding, ding, ding. You go out, you see the kids, you throw candy at them, and that's it. But no. This is a time of year when the veil between the living and the dead does get a little bit thin. And from my personal experience, I have seen things I cannot explain. For anybody who's watched one of those ghost hunter shows, you know that there's people who are devoting time, energy, money just to go out and investigate hauntings. There's some good ones, there's some bad ones, just like there is in everything in the world. Personally, I'm a fan of the Spooky South Coast crew because they respect the people that they deal with. They ask permission. They get all the clearances before they go in. They don't just barge in. But these paranormal groups have unfortunately inspired what I'm going to call a weekend warrior paranormal investigator. The weekend warrior paranormal investigator just kind of says, okay, I know of an abandoned building down here. I've heard there are ghosts there. Let me get out my thermometer. Let me get out my EMF detector. Let's go. They don't call anybody to say, hey, do I have your permission? They don't do any sort of reconnaissance to make sure the place is structurally safe. And they're dangerous, to be honest. I don't really have a problem with the professional teams going in and trying to find EVPs and all that sort of stuff. Because, in my opinion, they are honoring the tradition where you don't dishonor an ancestor by trampling on their grave. You don't invade their house. You pay them the proper respect. I've seen some things in my life. I honestly have. And while I don't think our ancestors necessarily stick around, I wouldn't rule it out. Especially in the case of tragedy. And for the one day of a year, whether you're supposed to be celebrating a saint, whether you're supposed to be honoring a relative, whatever it is, but you're busy passing out candy or dragging your kid around to houses to get candy, that's not Halloween. That's part of the celebration, and I'm all for celebrations. But we also need to remember that Halloween and Samhain are there to honor our relatives. I don't expect anybody out there to start offering up blood to the dead. As a matter of fact, I strongly I strongly advise against it. And I don't want people to be hiding in their basements afraid of ghosts and goblins. But I mean, there's another point. Remember the old days when we would make our costumes? And the old Charlie Brown story about where he goes out and he keeps getting a rock. That's completely out of the question too. And the paranormal is becoming so normalized. I mean, we have Scooby-Doo mysteries, we have the real Ghostbusters, although that show is ridiculously old at this point. But most people think of the paranormal as normal. It's just there. And this is not what we should be doing. The paranormal should always be treated with respect. If these are ghosts, they are ghosts who are once human. And they have needs and desires, just as I said before. I think we might be able to see them because the veil does get a little thin this time of year. And I find it interesting that these unqualified individuals running around to abandoned ruins, they get a lot of interference on their equipment. It could be possible that those are the spirits of the ancestors coming back to give them technical glitches. And that's because they are not being respectful. Halloween, we really need to get the consumerism out of it. If my kid wants to get homemade candy and wear a sheet over her head, pretend to be a ghost, I don't think that should be a problem. She shouldn't have to dress like Princess Peach. She shouldn't have to dress like a Power Ranger. She shouldn't have to dress like Paw Patrol. Although, she'll probably want to go as one of them. And our rules as a society have changed. Halloween, when I was younger, we went out, we got candy and stuff like that, and it was a treat. It was a once-a-year treat, but we also got all the great horror stories on the television, where you get Michael Myers, you would get Freddy Krueger, you would get these guys that you didn't get to see any other time of the year. These days, Freddy's not very scary, Michael's not very scary. As a matter of fact, I think it would be very difficult to make a good horror movie, one that would stand the test of time, because everything's been so commercialized. I mean, how many zombie films have there been? No, it's no longer Night of the Dead or even Night of the Living Dead, but at this point, it's vampires are not scary anymore, thanks to Twilight and series like that. So unless you really reach into mythology and pull out a Wendigo or something like that, there's no real mystery left in modern life. And this is why I think the paranormal shows, whether they're searching for Bigfoot, E.T., or whatever it is, that's the real reason that we have them, is because we've lost the connection to our own mystique in the Western world. And because of that, we are vicariously living through people on these shows. Because you and I don't want to go out in the middle of the night and search an abandoned bank and find out whether Al Capone's gold was down there. First of all, it's extremely unlikely it would be. And secondly, we don't have the time. We're so busy watching Game of Thrones or whatever the current series is. I don't know. I don't watch TV. I cut the cable a long time ago. But in all these situations, we see Halloween has been changed and changed and changed and changed from Samhain to get candy. And this is really something we need to change back. So in October 31st, if you do nothing else, do one thing. Light a candle for your ancestors. Make sure it's safe, make sure it's in a well-ventilated area, make sure it's not near anything flammable. But that one little gesture from you will mean the world to them. And worst case scenario, you're at least leaving a little bit extra light in the world, in a world that is in dire need of any light it can get at the present time. Thank you for watching the Silverlight Show. We wish you'll join us again next week, where we're going to continue with this paranormal month. It's kind of more up the alley. If you have any questions, concerns, please feel free to email us at silverlightservices@gmail.com. That's silverlightservices@gmail.com. Thank you and have a great day.